In this episode, Igor Volovich from Cumulus on compliance therapy. For another episode, I'm thrilled today to have Igor Volovich with me. First of all, Igor, thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me. I've wanted you on this podcast for a long time.
Thanks for having me. I've been excited about it for a long time myself.
You seem to be dressed in an outfit a little bit different for those listening to this podcast. You're in a doctor's coat with a stethoscope across your neck. Why are you so dressed?
It's a concept that we call compliance therapy. So we've been doing compliance for 11 years as a company called Cumulus, but our entire team has been doing it for many more years than that. And so collectively, we probably have hundreds of experience in compliance and security and risk management. And what we've come to find out, and the more we engage with the marketplace, we realize that most of the folks have these really weird misconceptions about what compliance is. We've accepted certain models of how compliance is done, what compliance means, what it delivers to the enterprise, and what it actually fails to deliver to the enterprise. And a lot of it has to do not with technology or lack thereof. We have plenty of technology in the compliance space, but the issue is really the mindset. And we came to realize that we need to reframe the mindset and really rejoin the conjoined twins of compliance and security and risk and get them back together. They've been separated at birth and we need to reattach, right? So there's a lot of changing of the minds that needs to happen. We need to do a lot of evangelism and educating folks about what compliance could mean to them, the kind of value it could deliver to them as they just unlock that hidden value. That's what we're about. And so compliance therapy is one of the ways that we engage with the marketplace. And we've been doing this for a little while and it's been getting well received. So we keep leaning into the concept. So here we are, compliance therapists in action.
So what are the intersections of compliance, security, and risk?
Our feeling is that they all join at the one pivot point, which is data, right? We all live on that same lake full of data and we all drink from it, fish on it. The only thing we don't do between those three functions is we don't really navigate those waters together, and we don't seem to speak the same language. But it's the same. These might be three different tribes, but they all form one nation. And so Cumulus, think of Cumulus as a ship that shows up on the horizon and says, "Hey, we speak all the three languages. We understand them intimately. We can bring these tribes together." And so there's a lot of metaphors here, of course, but that's what we found out it takes, right? Folks have kind of these ingrained, entrenched positions on what compliance is and, what it isn't. And so we have to translate. So think of Cumulus as the translating layer from a data perspective and also the translators from a human perspective.
So the Department of Justice has said that a chief compliance officer and a corporate compliance function must have visibility across all data sets in an organization, whether that is one big data lake, whether that is multiple silos of data, whatever it is, a CCO has to have visibility across that data. Is that consistent with this message you're trying to convey?
Absolutely. Visibility is one of the big things. And so what we again find out is when you look at most compliance programs, they run on opinion, not fact. What we mean by that is when you think about how many hands have been on a piece of data, let's call it data, big air quotes around data for those who are not watching this. The problem is that when you think about how you get to that compliance report in the end, the outcome being the audit or the compliance report or an assessment, that data typically comes from somebody looking at a control and saying, we believe it's passing or it's failing. And then somebody does some level of quality assurance, QA. So an ISSO has an ISSM, there's a manager, they take a look at it. From an audit perspective, of course, there is a principal auditor, they will look at it. If you're looking, let's say within a PCI context, it'll go back to PCI council and they'll look at it, right? So somebody's always looking at it, somebody's verifying, revalidating. But all of this is very manual, it's very subjective, it's very opinion-based. And so from a level of a single control, a single firewall rule, somebody has made a decision that they like it the way it is, right? That control passes, the control is actually effective. But it's not happening in real time. And even if they do a perfect job of it, every single time and every single person, they wake up on the right side of the bed every time and never make a mistake, the scale is just so massive. It's impossible to do this right every time. It's impossible to carry that across your entire environment, right? There's too many controls, too many data sets, too many systems in place. So how do we evolve from this opinion-based compliance management to objective evidence-based compliance management? That's the question that we asked.
Does this objective-based compliance management allow a more robust data analysis, or is that something completely different?
It's more robust, it's more trustworthy, it's more real, right? We're moving from fiction to fact. right? When you think about where a compliance report typically belongs from our perspective, if you were returning it to the library, if an auditor was checking out from the library, they might get it from the documentary section or the history section, most likely, right? Because typically most compliance reports are, well, they're history reports, right? We're looking at data back from, could be 3 years ago, certainly in the federal space. We're trying to make sure those compliance reports don't get returned to the fiction section after they've been read, because half of them could be fiction. We don't know. And that's the problem. Most compliance programs don't even know how much of their data, what they call data, again, big air quotes around that word, is subjective versus objective. And so we want to ensure that it is evidence, not opinion. And we want to eliminate manual interaction with that data. So the data can get massaged, right? You want trust to increase. And so for us, automation, and we are a compliance automation company, but we're not a bottom-up technology first. We have this automation capability, so let's throw it at the compliance space. We came at it from the compliance perspective. We looked at the compliance problem. We understood the compliance. Most of the compliance programs, again, manual. And the more hands you put on it, the less you can trust it, right? So for us, this is the big reveal. Like when we talk to customers, we talk to the marketplace, that's what we try to get them to understand. The more hands, the less you can trust it. The more massaging of the data, the less you can trust the final outcome, the final result. And so it's really important that not only do you have visibility, but you also have complete trust in the data that you're seeing.
So the process you've described, can that be folded into a data governance oversight or component as well?
No doubt. Absolutely. And the word that I like to use is also risk governance. And that's something that folks don't necessarily, you don't hear that term a lot. And what is governance, right? It's your ability to control your environment. And for me, mostly it's about controlling outcomes. How much can you influence the outcomes? And I remember having this conversation years ago with a CISO of a major federal environment where we talked about the idea of risk governance, and a lot of heads went sideways and folks were a little unsure what we meant by that. And what we meant is, look, when you look at the risk equation, we can't control the better half of it, right? We don't control what the attackers are going to do, right? They're going to do what they're going to do, right? Nation states, people get focused really tight on attribution, who did it, which hacker group did it, is it Lazarus group, is it ATP, whatever, right? And all of that is fine, but ultimately, no matter who they are, we can't control it, right? So what can we control? We can control what's within our domain, what's within our grasp, which is our own enterprise. So within the sphere of influence that we actually do have, how much control can you exert? How much control can you demonstrate reliably and credibly, right? So to me, that's the metric, right? How much risk can you control reliably, credibly within your environment? And how do you demonstrate that? So what's your level of control to a level of single control point? Where are you enforcing your risk mitigation? And how much do you know about what you know? How much can you prove about what you know? Is it belief or is it true? That's the thing that we try to focus on. So for me, risk governance, data governance, they work hand in hand. You can't have one without the other, right? Because if you don't have good, solid data architectures that underpin and overlay your entire environment, if you don't know where the data is coming from, who handles it, who's responsible for making sure that the data keeps flowing, how do you know what you know? And that's that kind of this epistemic questioning. I think it's very important.
I've heard you name at least 4 different corporate functions: internal audit, internal controls, compliance, and I'm going to add IT, the CISO.
Yep.
How do you get those people to start talking together to get this unified flow?
Great question. Accountability is one thing that binds them all. And we're seeing more and more scrutiny coming from places like the SEC, the FTC, the DHS, CISA. We're seeing less and less trust in what the data is that they're reporting, and more belief in, I want to see the data myself. CISA, DHS especially, we're seeing the binding operational directive that just came out on Monday, I believe. CISA is going to be scanning everybody's external interfaces. They don't trust the self-reporting. They don't trust the self-assessment. Similar story, DO DIBCAC. So anybody who's in defense industrial base now has to comply with what's called CMMC2. And this is an evolution from CMMC 1.0. Previously, defense contractors were able to self-assess and self-attest for their control posture. We've seen massive leakage of data. We've seen massive IP theft, especially from places like the People's Republic of China, the theft of the Lockheed Martin F-35 program and F-22 programs. So this is what the Department of Defense is trying to shore up. They understand that the anywhere from 80,000 to 300,000 defense contractors that are in the defense industrial base are really unprotected. And so they have to extend that blanket of protection, that similar level of protection against controlled unclassified information within that space, over to the private sector, right? And the lack of prior performance is certainly a guarantee of future results. They're not expecting good results if we keep doing things that way. So again, moving away from self-attestation, moving towards external-based attestation. And then automation, right? They want to know right now. They don't want to wait a month, 2 months, 3 months, or 2, 3 years to find out what a control state was at some point in time. It's useless. We're trying to manage risks in real time, and we're trying to manage threats that are happening 3 minutes from now with data from 3 years ago. It's impossible to do. So there's a lot of recognition across many regulatory bodies. That's an impossible problem to solve unless you embrace automation and you trust the data, not the people.
Is it possible to have continuous attestation?
Absolutely. There's something called CATO, right? So continuous authority to operate. That's something that is very big in federal government. That is, in fact, the evolutionary ultimate step of any ATO programs. So if you're authorizing systems to operate within a federal space, of course, that happens on a 3-year cycle. Yes, there is a recertification that happens within that time period, but it's not uncommon to find environments basically saying, look, we can only do so much in a single year of audits and assessments. We will just break up our environment in threes and we'll do 1/3 every year. And that's very common. We hear that from many federal agencies. So again, there's that time horizon, right? You're doing business with data from potentially 3 years ago, right? The hackers are going in real time now, navigating your OODA loops, except your OODA loops are 3 years old, right? So it's really tough. So yeah, it's possible. There is certainly a vision for that. And of course, you have to embrace automation. So we're seeing things like the operational. So this is OMB Memorandum M2131. So the deadline is actually August 27th. They gave the agencies 2 years, 2 years ago, almost to the date, and said, you have to shore up your monitoring capability. You have to collect logs. You have to centralize logs. You have to make sure they have good fidelity, they have good quality, that they're real time, and you're able to share them as needed. So if you have an incident, you're not going around hunting for data, that you actually know what's going on and you know what's going on in real time. So there's definitely a push towards that. There's ways to do it. The ultimate answer is, of course, automation. You can't throw more people at the problem, right? You can't call up, name your defense contractor and say, give me 1,000 more people tomorrow and we'll just process more paper. Those paper-based processes is the problem, right? So we need to automate, not digitize them, but automate around them. So I think that's a radical difference that we probably should get into.
Absolutely. So almost hate to say this, because to me, it's self-obvious or self-evident that the processes themselves should be automated. But how do you move people off spreadsheets?
You show them that their position is untenable. I think there's a lot of this acceptance of the status quo that historically has existed. And look, I don't blame any single agency. I don't blame any single CISO or chief risk officer or chief compliance officer or any of the ISSOs that are sitting there responsible for a portfolio of controls. I just blame our acceptance of the status quo as a society. Look, we haven't changed how we do compliance in 3,700 years. And I'm sure some of the audience might be going, what do you mean 3,700 years? We've had compliance 3,700 years. Yes, we did. Yeah, it was called the Code of Hammurabi. And people remember that from their history books. It's the first known to us so far written code of compliance. It was building code, right? And it was pretty harsh, right? The attribution and retribution, that whole model of deterrence, right? Past acts try to determine future acts or prevent future acts from happening. The idea was, if you build a building and it collapses on the family that lives in it, the architect or the builder will get the building collapsed onto them. Pretty much eye for an eye kind of deal, right? We've changed the way we do that, right? We don't collapse buildings onto people, and our building codes have become very sophisticated. And so when you build a skyscraper, you're able to examine everything floor by floor and figure out everything structurally, electrically, etc. Mostly it's about fire codes, right? But also integrity, structural integrity. We build things too fast in cybersecurity. And with things like continuous integration, continuous delivery, CI/CD, DevSecOps, there's a lot of automation built into that, right? Except all the compliance processes that are built to manage risk around those things are still very manual, right? So we have all this automation happening in the pipeline. We have no automation virtually happening in the compliance space. So the vehicle, the method for keeping risk at bay is highly manual, very legacy, and methodologically has not really changed. Philosophically has not changed in close to 4,000 years, right? So we see a big opportunity there to reframe the debate again and get people unseated from the status quo position that they've occupied very comfortably, because nobody's really asked them to do more until now. All the regulatory bodies are asking them to do more and giving them the tools to do it. Now, the problem is people are just not ready. So to your question, how do you get them off spreadsheets? You show them that it just stops being tenable. Their position is no longer possible to maintain because they cannot deliver the results that all the regulatory bodies are asking. And also in the commercial space, what their customers are asking. You have to be able to come to every deal being able to demonstrate your compliance posture. And it's not, and compliance is really synonymous with risk. We've divorced this kind of mentally, cognitively for a very long time because compliance has not been delivering any results on the risk front. But again, once you converge on that point, you realize that compliance and risk are the same. The only difference, risk is supposed to be done in real time and future facing, whereas compliance has been accepted as kind of this historical reporting function. That's the point of convergence. That's the point of opportunity.
So the only point on that I'm going to have to disagree on is I have a master's in labor and employment relations. And I have to point out to you the first code was actually an employment code. Now, the Code of Hammurabi was more sophisticated, but the first employment code was, on the seventh day he rested. So
Agreed.
labor and
I will
employment,
defer to you on that. Yes.
we do take it back to Genesis. But this, I'd like to explore a little bit this, what is a divergence of risk and compliance. And I say it in the context of one of the messages I try to communicate is that effective compliance equates to more efficient business processes, equates to greater ROI. And what I heard you say was that if we can conflate or join risk and compliance, we can look both forward and backwards, literally at the same time. Was that a fair summary?
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we call convergence, right? So we've termed this converged continuous compliance. And it's not just a great alliteration, but it's an easy tagline to follow. And kind of as you follow the bouncing ball across those words, converged, that it's that convergence of risk, compliance, and security. But more importantly, when you peel the covers a little bit, the convergence point is dual, right? On the one hand, we're converging on data. We recognize the fact that there is no compliance data, risk data, security data. It's all data. Especially when you start moving into big data analytics platforms, the data is just there, right? You can pull it from anywhere. You can make sense of it from any kind of context. And the context that we're providing it from our perspective as a translating layer for compliance is the context of controls. So we shift the conversation from what kind of firewall do I need to buy? What kind of endpoint detection and response do I need to buy? What kind of SOAR? What kind of XDR? These tend to be very technical, very much in the weeds conversations, and they tend to be also fairly political. We have a Symantec team in our environment. We have an IDS team in our environment. We have a McAfee team, right? These are literally the names that are used in many organizations, within CISO shops especially. We also recognize most CISO shops are not run as risk shops. They're run as technology management shops. And so when it becomes budget renewal time, it's a conversation about what else to buy, what's the next thing, we need to appropriate some of this budget, right? These are the conversations. They are not risk driven. There are some nascent efforts to map threat models to capabilities. That's about as evolved as we've seen it. Typically, risk does not enter into it all that much. It still tends to be a very much technical conversation. By being so technical, it excludes the higher level, higher echelon folks like the chief legal officer. They can't understand this, and lawyers are notorious technophobes to begin with, right? The CEO doesn't want to learn what's the difference between XDR and ETDR, right? And we love our acronyms, and we love our lingo, and we love our little slang, and we keep folks out. We're not inclusive with our language, right? We're not inclusive with our technology knowledge. And again, you have to abstract. And how do you abstract? You have to abstract by talking about controls and talking about risk. So you elevate that conversation. And from a perspective of how do you talk risk to business? They understand risk intimately. They get it. And so if you can translate technology into capabilities into controls, into frameworks, and then that's where we start talking about risk, right? These frameworks were built on risk models and threat models, right? PCI DSS, that's about stopping attacks against cardholder environments, right? FISMA, federal environments, and on we go. Great ideas, very detailed. NIST, there's an entire campus over in Maryland creating these standards. They're great standards. They have industry input. They have academic input. They do research for years and years before they publish them, and they've been publishing more and more every day. Now you have things coming out of the OMB, M2131, M2209, the Zero Trust. You got DHS, CISA. There is no shortage of great ideas. These are all wonderful ideas. The problem is implementation. That's where things really fall apart, is we implement them, again, as a historical reporting function. The lens is clear, except we keep pointing that telescope backwards. That is what we need to change. And when you change that, people realize, guess what? All of this effort that I'm spending on doing my compliance management, I've actually been doing risk management. I've just been doing it retroactively. So we changed that perspective, we shifted forward, and they realized, guess what? It's the same data. And if I do it real time, I can manage risk forward.
Igor, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I wanted to ask before we leave if anyone wanted more information on yourself, any of the topics we've touched on, or more on Cumulus, where would be the best place or places for them to go?
Absolutely. I can be found on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there. Igor Volovich, IGOR VOLOVICH. I'm also on Twitter at Cyber Igor. And Cumulus, of course, it's Cumulus, QMULOS.com. Again, it's QMULOS.com. We have plenty of materials, and we have a lot of strategy papers that we invite folks to download and take a look. We have recently published a guide called Rethinking Compliance, where we talk about convergence of compliance, security, and risk, and also 7 considerations for compliance automation. So it's another great white paper I recommend everybody go and read. And of course, stay active on our page, stay active on our LinkedIn profile. We're very active with publishing these kinds of things. And of course, very active in the forums like these. And of course, I appreciate your time and thank you for inviting us to share our views.
Thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me. I hope we can continue this conversation.
Absolutely, Tom. Thank you so much.
If you'd like more information on Cumulus, check out the show notes where we link to it. Also, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe or rate and review wherever great podcasts are listened to. The award-winning Data Driven Compliance is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.